Hello everyone, it's Seth, probably better known as Saffron Olive, and it's time for another edition of Against the Odds. So last week on our Against the Odds poll, it was Azor's Elocuters coming in way ahead of everything else, another blowout on the Against the Odds poll. So this week, we are heading to Modern to play a deck that I'm calling Filibusted. So I might be giving this deck too much credit, but we are going to try to break it with the filibuster counters from Azor's Elocutors. A quick reminder before we jump into it, if you enjoy Against the Odds, if you enjoy this video set, take a minute and click the like button, subscribe to the channel, leave a comment. All this stuff is super helpful, and that would be awesome of you. Anyway, let's talk about Filibusted in Modern. So the plan of this deck is to win with Azor's Elocutors, which is a 5-mana 3/5 that gets a filibuster counter at the beginning of your upkeep, and then, if you have 5 or more filibuster counters on it, you win the game. The problem is, whenever we take damage from a source, we gotta remove a counter. So if our opponent lightning bolts our face, we remove a counter. If our opponent attacks with a bunch of creatures and one of them hits us, we remove a counter. So it's not quite just sit it out on the battlefield for 5 turns and you win the game. It's a little more complicated than that. So my thinking is that in Modern, a pretty fast and efficient format, we probably can't plan on waiting till turn 5 at the earliest, playing our Elocutors, and just hoping that 5 turns later we win the game. That doesn't seem all that practical. So we're going to try to speed things up a little bit with Paradox Haze and also Contagion Clasp. So Paradox Haze, 3-mana blue enchantment. At the beginning of enchant a player's upkeep, so you enchant a player, which we'd enchant ourselves when it enters the battlefield, but at the beginning of the enchant a player's upkeep, you get an additional upkeep. So instead of getting 1 filibuster counter each turn, if we have a Paradox Haze on the battlefield, we would get 2 filibuster counters, and in theory, if we get enough Paradox Hazes on the battlefield, we could go from 0 filibuster counters all the way up to 5 filibuster counters in 1 turn, because we get an extra upkeep for each Paradox Haze and they stack. So the other thing we can do is Contagion Clasp. This works a little bit differently, but Contagion Clasp allows us to pay for, tap it, and proliferate, so we choose any number of target permanents or players that have counters on them and add another counter to them. When it enters the battlefield, we get to put a -1/-1 counter on something, so we can kill a Unflipped Delver of Secrets, a Snapcaster Mage, a Dark Confidant, anything with 1 toughness. But then we can also kill something bigger by proliferating, so we put the counter on it, then next time we proliferate, we put another -1/-1 counter on it. So very slowly, we can actually kill big things with it. But the main thing is, this is kind of the backup to Paradox Haze, so maybe we only have 3 Paradox Hazes, which would get us from 0 counters up to 4 counters on our Azor's Elocutors, but 1 Proliferate thrown into that mix would allow us to go from 0 all the way up to 5 counters in 1 turn. So instead of waiting, which just doesn't seem practical, we're using Paradox Haze and Contagion Clasp to kind of try to one-shot our opponent in some scenarios, or in the very worst, at least speed up the clock. So instead of waiting 5 turns to complete the filibuster, maybe we're doing it in 3 turns or 2 turns. Plus, these cards help outweigh the counters that are being removed when we're dealt damage. If we're just waiting 5 turns, a lightning bolt to our face or an electrolyze to our face would really be a time walk, because our deck is very unlikely to win unless we're winning with our filibuster counters from Azor's Elocutors. So any damage would essentially be a time walk for us actually winning the game. These cards help outweigh that, so even if we don't get the one-shot kill, it does speed up the process a lot. The single Lightning Greaves, 100% solely to put on our Azor's Elocutors to make sure it doesn't die to Path to Exile, or I don't know, roast, or whatever targeted removal happens to be around. Gives the creature haste and shroud. Haste isn't especially relevant, but it's free to equip, so we play the Elocutors, hopefully our opponent's tapped out, stick the Lightning Greaves on it, and our Elocutors can conduct their filibuster while wearing the boots, and hopefully that will protect them. It takes something like Supreme Verdict then to actually kill the Elocutors once it's Greaves up. And then, since we're playing Paradox Haze, we got a couple other sweet synergies. So, as I mentioned, if we can get enough Paradox Hazes on the battlefield, we can use Chronomantic Escape a 6-mana sorcery that says until your next turn, creatures can attack you, but then you exile it from the game with 3 time counters to basically lock creatures out of the game completely. It has suspend 3, so instead of waiting till we get 6 mana, we can suspend it on turn 3 for 2 and a white, and then every 3 turns it would come down. Well, it's not really 3 turns. Normally it's 3 turns because 1 turn of magic comes with 1 upkeep, but it's 3 upkeeps because with suspend cards, the time counter is removed on your upkeep. So if you have multiple upkeeps with Paradox Haze, you speed up the process of any suspend cards. So if we can get a Chronomatic Escape either suspended or cast and have 2 Paradox Hazes on the battlefield, we will get to cast Chronomatic Escape every single turn, which, unless our opponent can disrupt it somehow with a counter spell or something, means that we can just never be attacked by creatures again, which means we're not removing those filibuster counters from Azor's Elocuters, which helps us get the 5 filibuster counters we need to win the game. Ancestral Visions I would have played even without Paradox Haze, just because drawing cards is sweet, and we're kind of a control-ish deck that needs card advantage, but Ancestral Visions, if you got a few Paradox Hazes on the battlefield, you can turn it into a real Ancestral Recall. Well, almost. You wait 1 turn. So it speeds up the process on Ancestral Visions as well. Then we have just a bunch of control-ish cards. The main goal here, apart from keeping ourselves alive for the million turns necessary to actually win with our Elocuters, is we got a lot of cards that can keep us from being dealt damage. Cryptic can counter a spell that's going to deal damage to us. We can also use it to tap down all our opponent's creatures to keep them from dealing damage to us. Supreme Verdict kills all our opponent's creatures, kind of an oboe with Elocuters, so we kind of want to do it before we get our Elocuters on the battlefield because we don't really want to wrath away our Elocuters. Path to Exile kills a creature. Remand draws us a card, plus it can keep us from getting hit for 1 turn. I imagine there could be situations where we're about to get the last counter on our Azor's Elocuters. Our opponent throws a bolt at our face. Maybe they don't have the mana to recast it. We can remand it and get that last counter and win. Plus, remand is just a good card in general. Then we have a Dawn Charm, which is another fog effect, another way. It's actually one of the perfect cards for the deck because it does 2 things. First off, it's a fog. It prevents all combat damage that would be dealt, so it keeps our opponent from removing counters from our Azor's Elocuters with creatures by attacking. It can also counter a spell that targets us, so it can also stop our opponent from throwing a lightning bolt at our face to get a counter off of our Elocuters that way. And then a couple of Snapcaster Mages to flashback our Dawn Charm, our Cryptic Commands, our Remands, our Path to Exiles, all that good stuff. Mana base wise, we have a bunch of fetches. We have some fetchable lands, Hallowed Fountain Island, Plains. We have Colonnades as our creature land, and then a little bit of disruption for lands in Ghost Quarter and Tectonic Edge to deal with Tron, deal with other creature lands, and so forth. In the sideboard, we have some more ways to keep ourselves from being dealt damage to hopefully get more counters on our Elocuters. Leyline of Sanctity is a big one. Burn decks would be really problematic for us, since they have so many ways of dealing damage to us. It would be very, very difficult to ever get the 5 filibuster counters, while Leyline just locks burn spells pretty much out of the game. Can also be good even against, I don't know, Delver decks, other decks that are playing creatures, but also playing a lot of burn spells. Basically, we don't want to be getting hit in the face with burn spells. Discard is also troubling, since the one way we can win the game is a 5-mana creature, so a Thoughtseize could strip those out of our hand before we ever get to cast our Azor's Elocuters. Another Dawn Charm for the fog effect for creature matchups. Supreme Verdict, kind of the same thing. In creature-heavy matchups, we want the additional Wrath, and Ghostly Prison makes it harder for our opponent to attack with creatures. Very helpful against go-wide creature strategies that are making a bunch of little things because our opponent would have to pay 2 mana for each one that wants to attack. So there are some matchups where it's pretty good as well. Then we get to play just some of the good sideboard cards in Modern. Grafdigger's Cage for Collected Company, for Narset, for Dredge, Rest in Peace, also for graveyard-based decks, Stony Silence, Affinity, Tron, any artifact-based decks. A couple of Negates as an additional counter spell. And then, last but not least, we are playing against the odds. We are playing a blue deck. That means we got a couple briberies. So if we run into Tron or a deck with Emrakul, maybe we can keep our streak alive of stealing our opponent's huge threat from their library. Anyway, that is our Azor's Elocutors deck in Modern. I'm calling it filibusted because I'm optimistic with this one. I think that we can maybe assemble enough pieces to win, let's say, 33.33% of the time, 1 out of every 3 games, which would be pretty decent for an against the odds deck. I don't think it's great by any means. I think Azor's Elocutors, it's definitely going to be hard to pull off, but I'm hopeful that with the pieces we have, we'll be able to make it work. Anyway, thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed the videos, and I will talk to you soon.